Hello, listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacco Zwetsloot, and today's special edition podcast is being recorded during the Lunar New Year holiday period on Monday, the 31st of January, 2022, in the NK News studio. For the first time, we are recording the podcast using StreamYard in order to quickly output a high-quality video for posting on YouTube. This is the first time we've tried this new technology or software, and this video will be released this podcast will be released both as a video and an audio-only podcast episode. We hope that our listeners and viewers will approve, and we look forward to your feedback. I am joined today by NK News reporters Chatter Jeongmin Kim and Colin Zwirko, who are with me in the studio, and Ankit Panda, who joins us live from the United States to talk about North Korean miscellany. And yes, that's a pun, and we hope you will forgive it. Before we get started, please check out nknews.org and consider buying a subscription. For much less than the price of a cup of coffee a day, you can have access to all the excellent articles that my colleagues put out every day. Secondly, please leave a review about this podcast wherever you can, whether that be on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your Android preferred download service of choice. That is so that people can find our podcast much more easily. We need to get some more listeners this year, so please help us achieve my personal goal of reaching 10% of Joe Rogan's massive audience. I think we can do it. Thirdly, follow all of us on Twitter. You'll find NK News at nknews.org, so that's easy. Chatter Carol is ChatOCL. Jeongmin Kim is Jeongmin Kim, one word with two N's in the Jeongmin. Colin Zwirko is his name as one word. Ankit Panda is at NKTPND, and I'm at Jacco Z. For podcast suggestions and feedback, you can tweet us or email us at podcast@nknews.org. Welcome back on the show, Chad, Jeongmin, Colin, and Ankit.
Hey.
I had hoped that this Lunar New Year's break would be a quiet one full of rest and relaxation, but then North Korea launched yet another missile yesterday morning, the seventh so far this year, and the biggest one in 5 years. So let's get to the details of this launch first. Ankit, what kind of missile was this?
So the North Koreans launched the Hwasong-12, which is one of their workhorse ballistic missiles. It's pretty much the missile that they developed specifically to hold the U.S. territory of Guam at risk. The North Koreans don't like Guam very much because it hosts Andersen Air Force Base, among other facilities, and it's where the U.S. actually carries out quite a few of its bomber operations near the Korean Peninsula from B-1Bs and B-52s alike. So just the vital statistics of this launch, launched from Chagang province, where North Korea tends to launch many of its longer range capabilities from near the Mupyeongri arms factory. Flight distance on the Earth's surface, 800 kilometers. Of course, the altitude was 2,000 kilometers. The moment I saw the altitude actually yesterday on my phone was when it told me that we were back to potentially a 2017-like scenario. And so this is a big deal. This is the seventh launch of the Hwasong-12, and it is the fourth in a row to be successful. And I think we should talk about where this might lead us in the coming months and years.
You said that the range was 800 and how many kilometers?
So the rough number provided by the South Korean authorities was 800 kilometers. I should note that with the trajectory that they demonstrated, the reason we had a pretty good indicator this was a Hwasong-12 before even seeing the North Korean state media release on the 31st was because the trajectory almost exactly matched the first successful lofted flight test of the Hwasong-12 in May 2017. I believe it was May 14th, 2017 was when this missile first succeeded.
Okay, and to help us understand a little bit better, is that close to the maximum range of the Hwasong-12, or could it actually go much further?
No, so lofted trajectories are something that the North Koreans do to ensure that missile tests don't unnecessarily overfly Japan or other countries. And so they actually made a point of this in their statement. They noted that they launched it on a lofted trajectory to avoid risking the security of their neighbors, which is thoughtful of them.
Right, they haven't always been that thoughtful in the past, have they?
They haven't, but they've made that point about why they do lofted tests before. But yes, if they tested this on what's known as a minimum energy trajectory, basically a normal trajectory, the kind of trajectory you would use if you wanted to maximize the missile's range, this missile would fly to around 4,300 to 4,500 kilometers, certainly sufficient to range Guam.
Now, you said that the altitude it flew at was, or the altitude it reached was 2,000 kilometers. That's, to a layman like me, that's pretty high. Is that just about low Earth orbit altitude?
So that's actually funny that you say that, because low Earth orbit actually ends at 2,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface.
Okay, so it's at the upper range or the upper limit of low Earth. So does that make it a? What does that make it actually?
It doesn't make it anything. It's still a suborbital object. It still comes down. But I mean, just for comparison, the International Space Station spends most of its time at about 400 kilometers. So if you're watching this missile test on the International Space Station, you'd have to actually look up, so to speak.
Okay, that's a great metric to compare it to. So yeah, it would have gone feasibly. It could have gone up and over and out down the other side of the space station if they'd been in the same area.
I suppose so, but the space station would be in orbit, moving around the Earth very quickly.
Okay, so it actually left Earth's atmosphere, if I understand correctly.
That is right. Yeah, the atmosphere, there's a debate about where the atmosphere ends, but 100 kilometers, give or take, is where most people think it does end. So any ballistic missile that's of any meaningful range will actually exit the Earth's atmosphere. Of course, what's interesting is that most of North Korea's missile tests since May 2019, when they resumed missile testing, have been spending most of their time in the atmosphere, and the reasons for that really have to do with missile defense. But to test a missile of this range, you have to leave the atmosphere.
Now, what about these supersonic gliders that we've been hearing a bit about lately? How high do they need to go up usually?
So with hypersonic gliders, it depends. So you can exit the a glider doesn't need to exit the Earth's atmosphere. You can launch it on a depressed trajectory and then insert it into the Earth's atmosphere when it begins gliding and heading towards its target. But in the case of, let's say, the maneuverable reentry vehicle that the North Koreans tested, the ideal way to use that would be to launch it on a normal ballistic trajectory where it would exit the atmosphere, and then the reentry vehicle, as it enters the atmosphere, would begin to glide. The best way to think about the difference between space and the Earth's atmosphere is that the atmosphere is actually very much like a liquid. We breathe the air, so I think intuitively think of the atmosphere as something that's particularly empty. But to a ballistic missile reentry vehicle coming in at very high speeds, the atmosphere might as well just be a liquid. And so that's where that change in medium allows for those aerodynamic forces to come into effect, allowing for that gliding. The Hwasong 12 doesn't do any of this. It's just a good old-fashioned ballistic reentry vehicle that just comes down to Earth at massive speeds, relying primarily on gravity.
Right. I've also seen the word apogee used in some of the figures here with altitude and apogee and range. I'm confess that I'm complete novice to this. What is an apogee and how does that differ from the altitude?
So apogee just refers to the maximum altitude in flight. With orbital objects, an apogee is the highest point in an orbit. With a ballistic missile, it's just the highest point in the ballistic arc. A ballistic arc is just a parabola, so it's the highest point in that parabola over the Earth's surface.
Okay, well, to our other colleagues, perhaps let me turn to Jeongmin first. What has South Korean media reported about this latest launch?
South Korean media, at first, they were quoting JCS, the details that were coming out yesterday morning. But let's talk about South Korean government reaction, actually. Moon Jae-in administration, they have been avoiding a too hawkish of a statement against a new North Korean missile since last year. But because these were back-to-back missiles and then IRBM, intermediate range ballistic missiles, it's different from other type of missiles that were tested this year in terms of political signaling. So President Moon actually issued the strongest level of statement on the IRBM, saying that South Korea condemns it. And there was an emergency NSC meeting held right afterwards. And they were talking about how they are concerned that North Korea is nearing or approaching near the rescinding of the self-imposed moratorium by Kim Jong-un in the past.
Right. Wow. Okay. And that's obviously very important. We'll return to that question in a moment. But what has North Korean media reported about this launch, if anything?
North Korean media has, in my personal opinion, it seems that they are toning down the IRBM test by not putting it on the front page. And the report was very short. It was very, I could say that it was technical rather than including any outrageous anti-US sentiments or any political statements into the North Korean report. It was more about who conducted the test, who was there, or what kind of test it was.
Did they confirm the name of the missile as Hwasong 12? Was that specifically mentioned?
Yes, they did.
Okay. Chad, as I mentioned at the start of the episode, this is the 7th launch this year. Put this in the context of the launches we've seen this year, and then also broaden out a bit to bring us back to 2017, the big year of missile test launches.
Yeah, so this year we've seen 7 missile tests. It's been the most high-frequency testing we've seen. 7 missile launch events in less than a month. But when you look at how North Korean state media has presented these, there's basically 3 types of missile tests. There's developmental tests, these hypersonic missiles, which were a goal set out by Kim Jong-un at the Congress in January 2021. There are also tests which are basically quality control tests, such as the Hwasong 12 intermediate range ballistic missile that we saw tested yesterday. And there's also, I would say, politically motivated tests, which was the train-launched ballistic missile that we saw just hours after the US designated North Korea with new unilateral sanctions. So I think if you zoom in and just read what North Korean state media says, there are basically 3 types of explanations for these tests going on. But for me, the much more interesting aspect to all of this is the geopolitical timing. We have Russia-Ukraine tensions. We have the South Korean presidential election coming up. We have the Olympics. And we also have domestic problems in North Korea. And I think basically a perfect window of opportunity came out of all these sets of news events coming at the same time to really encourage Kim Jong-un to accelerate testing in the last 30 days. Basically, because of Ukraine, he has cover to some extent in testing. He knows that Washington is pretty much preoccupied with that. So it's hard for the US to, strike up a major new maximum pressure style policy that we saw in the Trump administration with the South Korean election on the way. He knows that everyone in politics here is focused on that. With the Olympics about to start, China, for its part, is focused on that. And if North Korea stops the testing now and waits until the Olympics are over, I think Kim will probably get away with this without angering Xi Jinping too much. And domestically, we saw this food crisis situation last year. We've seen lots of page coverage in the Nodong Shinmun and broadcast time on state TV dedicated to North Korea's economic problems. Like, they are putting those problems and talking about them first and foremost in state media. And it's very unlikely Kim Jong-un is going to turn that economic situation around anytime soon. But Kim Jong-un does know that he is able to show missile development progress. That's one area he still does have pretty strong control and is able to show results. So I think all of this came together to encourage North Korea to really pursue this missile testing with a rigor that we haven't and a frequency that we've yet seen so far.
Colin, what have you seen from the air? Were preparations for this launch visible ahead of time, or is this something that North Korea can feasibly do out of sight of satellites or spy planes?
Well, this has South Korea said that it took place in Mupyeong area of Jagang province on Sunday, soon after the launch. So that was in a place that people have been watching for quite some time. It's a missile factory. And so if someone was in the habit of checking that missile factory every day, they might have seen something happen in high resolution imagery. But I assume, as Ankit said, this would have been taken off of the assembly line and tested as to make sure that the ones that they're producing are of high quality. So if you're watching this missile factory, you're expecting there to be missiles going around. I don't know. I've never seen a high-res image of that factory with missiles out on the parking lot or anything.
Practically speaking, I'm wondering, is this a solid fuel thing, or is it a liquid fueled missile? Is it something that has to be erected for quite a while before it actually launches, or could you get it up and shoot it within an hour?
I'd say, Ankit, is the expert on that, but I believe it's a liquid fueled and they have to set it up.
Yeah, it is. It is a liquid-fueled missile. They didn't tell us that. They've been talking about this new technique called ampulization, which is an obscure piece of Soviet missile jargon, but basically means liquid-fuel missiles that you don't have to fuel in the field. The Soviets basically came up with this innovation to put liquid-fueled missiles on submarines, where they could fuel them and do submarine patrols with a fueled liquid-fuel missile, which is dangerous. But anyways, so they didn't tell us that they ampulized the system, and there's no external indicators that I really picked up in the images that would indicate either way. But if it was ampulized, the warning time might have been lower. But in the past, also, one of the reasons there has been a lot of warning for these tests has been, the U.S. intelligence community observes, for instance, that Kim Jong-un's observation area is being set up, until they switch to the new mobile viewing platform, which Kim used to view the maneuverable reentry vehicle test earlier this month. It was pretty obvious because they would put up a desk, where Kim Jong-un would have his pointer and his binoculars and his little drink and watch these tests. And so that would go up a day or so in advance, and then the missile would be erected and fueled, and Kim Jong-un would often be given a tour. He'd be briefed on what was being done. And so without Kim's personal involvement in these tests, my expectation is that the amount of warning has probably gone down quite a bit. And that's dangerous for a variety of reasons, right? I mean, there was this incident earlier this month where the U.S. had a ground stop for all civilian aircraft on the West Coast because the trajectory of the maneuverable reentry vehicle was somehow misinterpreted by U.S. early warning systems, right? I should also point out that the Hwasong-12 uses the very same engine for its first stage as the Hwasong-14 ICBM and in a modified form in the Hwasong-15 ICBM. So if there isn't a lot of warning and the U.S. is picking up on these launches after the fact in some cases, that could lead to some dangerous kind of false alarm scenarios like we did see earlier this month.
Yeah, and
is there
so
also sorry, go on, Colin.
A couple of analysts on Twitter have pretty much for sure geolocated where this test took place yesterday, and so it's at this missile factory, and that's where the Hwasong-14 was tested in 2017 as well. So yeah, if it's one thing you want to know when they're going to test a missile, I think people, intelligence agencies, and also independent analysts have been watching this factory for a long time. So, but I guess the other issue is not knowing it. You want to know when they're going to test a missile, sure, but you want to know the military wants to know where they could. Do they have a chance of spotting a missile before it's launched in the case of war? And so then you'd probably want Ankit to talk about the launch vehicle and how capable that is, because that's what they really care about is, would this be detectable prior to launch in the case of war?
Yeah, yes, exactly. And is this something that requires one of those transport erector launchers or TELs, or how does this work, Ankit?
Yeah, so pretty much all of North Korea's ground-launched, well, not pretty much, all of North Korea's ground-launched ballistic missiles are road mobile. So they use transporter erector launchers or mobile erector launchers. I'm not going to get into the difference between those two. Basically, vehicles, very large vehicles that move these missiles around, they erect the missiles into a vertical position, and then the missiles ignite and fly off outside the Earth's atmosphere to their eventual targets. The TEL that was used in this test was a Maz 547 style TEL. These are TELs that the North Koreans imported from Belarus, which manufactured them. And they have in the order of around 30 or so of these. So a decent number. These were previously used for the Musudan, which was the first intermediate range ballistic missile that didn't actually perform as the North Koreans would have liked. They had 7 test failures out of 8 flight tests for the Musudan in 2016. And so now they've gone all in on the Hwasong-12, which is a much better missile system. But, on the TEL, there's a couple interesting observations, I suppose. With the earlier testing, so the Hwasong-12 was a failure at the start. They had 3 flight tests of the Hwasong-12 in April 2017 that failed. And it's possible that some of these failures caused some damage to these very valuable launch vehicles, because if the missile explodes right as it ignites, that's going to be a very large explosion that the vehicle probably wouldn't be able to withstand. And it's possible that a total loss of the vehicle might be likely, or it would require significant repairs. And so for a while, what the North Koreans were doing with their large missiles, including the Hwasong-12, when they first tested it in May 2017, was they would use a firing table where the missile would be erected and the TEL would actually drive away, and then the missile would launch, because if something did go wrong, all you would lose is the missile. You wouldn't actually damage the TEL. And so what we've seen with the August 2017 test of the Hwasong-12 and the September 2017 test, both of which when the Hwasong-12 overflew Japan, and this latest test, is that the launch is being carried out off the TEL itself. The TEL is not pulling away. It is erecting the missile and it is launching it. And what does that tell us? I think that tells us that the North Koreans are quite confident at this point in the reliability of this missile and the engine. And that's sort of the policy implication of why we shouldn't want them to test these kinds of missiles, even if the North Koreans want us to believe that these are now a fact of life and very mundane activities for them. It's because each and every test of a given missile and a given engine, for instance, will allow them to improve the reliability, gather more data. Overall, I think this is actually the 13th test, 13th flight test of the RD-250 variant engine, which is what they use in not only the Hwasong-12, but they also use just the Hwasong-8 hypersonic glider, the MARV, the Hwasong-14 ICBM, and in a two-chamber configuration with the Hwasong-15. So
I want to jump in for a moment there and just ask Chad that Chad, we've talked before, I think, when we had when they had in Pyongyang one of those military parades about just the importance of transporter erector launchers and how North Korea went from having very few of them, and they were a very scarce resource, to suddenly having quite a lot more of them. And we talked about how it seems possible that North Korea is now producing its own TELs, right? So the fact that they're now feeling confident enough to launch missiles directly off the TELs without driving them away shows that A, they're confident that it'll work out without blowing up the TEL, and B, they also have enough TELs that if it does blow up, they can supply another one.
I like Ankit said, though, I still think they wouldn't want to waste these just on a mere test event. I think they're still going to want to be testing these with fairly reliable missile designs. So, for example, if there's there's this new Hwasong-17 ultra large ICBM, which we saw rolled out in the October 2020 military parade. And that was on this new, I think it was 11 axle TEL. I'd be interested to see how that one will be tested. Will it be off the TEL or off one of these launch tables, like Ankit said? Because while they do have a capability to develop these, I think it's still relatively nascent, and it will take time for them to be able to really roll out dozens and dozens of these things at future military parades.
The Olympics, of course, are starting in just 4 days' time on Friday, the Beijing Winter Olympics. I want to talk about the concept of an Olympic truce. Is that a thing, and how long has that been a thing, and how long does that usually last? Who wants to fill us in on that?
I can share a few bits on that. Yeah, there is such thing as an Olympic truce. It was, when there should be no conflict, in order for sports participants in the Olympics to get there safely, come back, and it should wrap, I believe, like a week before the Olympics starts, and also a week or so after it ends. So that presumably is active right now and would be active until mid-March when the Paralympics end, because of course it's not just the Olympics itself. There'll be a pause and then the Paralympics. And so, yeah, I mean, this is I'm operating on the assumption that Kim Jong-un suspends missile testing as of today. If he continues and we see an increasing tempo or like larger missiles tested, then I think that's an indicator that there is something maybe up with the China-North Korea relationship that we're not aware of. I don't think that's going to happen, but if it does happen, it's a sign of disrespect. We saw this in 2017. North Korea would sometimes launch missiles on the opening ceremonies of major political events in China. It wasn't well appreciated by China at the time, and we saw, as a result of that, this acrimony emerging between Chinese and North Korean state media. So I'm very interested to see if they do this. I don't think if they continue testing through the Olympics and this supposed era of peace, it's not going to put them in a good position come March, when they start traditionally warning of USFK drills and wanting restraint from South Korea on that. You'll have a new president in South Korea. And so, yeah, I think it will be interesting to see how this goes.
Does it?
Sorry, you're
Sorry, does anybody want to comment on Chad's thoughts there?
Well, I guess I don't actually have the statistics, but I would wonder if has the U.S. ever tested any of their systems during the Olympics? Because it all comes down to perception. So Chad's right that China would, based on how they've reacted in the past in terms of North Korea testing around events, then China would probably perceive that as disrespectful. But North Korea frequently talks about the double standards, and if it's just for internal testing purposes, then how can that be a provocation? But the neighbors will see it as a provocation, so it just depends if they're willing to test that.
Yeah, I think that the key thing is if North Korea does a large test and it corresponds with an opening ceremony or a major part of the Olympics, of course, it just diverts attention away from the Olympics, which is meant to be symbolic of peace and all of that. And so it's just undermining Xi Jinping's big show, I guess. That's how I see it.
Yeah, the other thing to watch for in, I think, February is, Kim's talked about this idea of, so Kim Jong-il's birthday on February 16th at the Politburo meeting earlier this month. Kim said that he wanted to see that celebrated with splendor. And so does that mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll carry out a missile test, could be a military parade or some kind of other demonstration. But, the North Koreans have their own impetus. And I think this idea that, there's always been tension in the North Korea-China relationship. That's, frankly speaking, I don't think it's ever been fully perceptible to those of us on the outside, especially as it happens in hindsight. We can perhaps appreciate some things a little bit more clearly. But I think China will grit its teeth and probably tolerate some more activity if the North Koreans do decide to go forward with it. I think there's a difference between obviously launching during an opening ceremony or something like that, which, they did that with the Belt and Road Forum in 2017 and even the opening of the Hangzhou G20, if I recall correctly, in 2016. And so they've done that in the past. But right now, obviously, the relationship has improved quite a bit. So I agree with Chad that I think, we're going to be looking for some indicators over the Olympics about how the North Koreans behave here.
Jeongmin, you wanted to say something?
Also, I think we have to consider the dynamic between China and the U.S. when it comes to UNSC resolutions and also sanctions. Recently, it seemed that China is still backing up North Korea for avoiding additional sanctions. But it seems to me that North Korea intentionally toned down the publicization of intermediate range ballistic missile to irritate the United States a little bit, but not so much with China. They will probably keep a close eye on what kind of actual action will come out of Washington after this IRBM, whether or not they will consider this as reaching near rescinding moratorium. And then if China joins in on sanctions, additional sanctions, which I think is unlikely, that may change North Korea's mind about testing further missiles, I think. But for now, it seems that because China is backing up North Korea with avoiding additional sanctions while the U.S. is still pursuing it, it seems we're in this little window where we see how North Korea will react to further actions from the United States.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. I mean, there's been a lot of talk in recent months on this podcast, in our articles within the North Korea watching community, that North Korea, especially last year, has attempted to routinize its missile testing, make it less about Kim Jong-un himself or petulant reactions to foreign relations, and more about the sort of mature approach of a military interested in self-defense, not focusing on any particular externality as the cause for all of this. And if you look at what we've just had in January, 7 types of missile tests, no UN sanctions, an IRBM test, a hypersonic test. Basically, North Korea is pushing the Rubicon of what is acceptable. It's creating new benchmarks about what it can do in future without risking sanctions or maybe even limited military action or movement of military assets into the region. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. If you rewind to 2019, we've seen a solid fuel submarine launched ballistic missile, intermediate range. We've seen a hypersonic missile, and now we've seen an intermediate range missile. All of this, I think, taken together as a North Korean effort to basically compel the international community to accept, whether it likes it or not, that North Korea is a nuclear weapon state. But there's a paradox in all of this, as far as I'm concerned, because while it's edged towards these benchmarks relatively successfully, how can its, we assume, still important goal of gaining international sanctions relief be won if and when we move into the realm of nuclear testing again, or ICBM testing? In the Congress of January 2021, Kim Jong-un revealed an intent to have a solid fuel ICBM, to launch spy satellites, to refine the precision targeting of missiles up to 15,000 kilometers away. We've also seen in military parades multiple missiles that have not yet been tested that would probably change the sort of balance, or tilt it away from this kind of turning a blind eye phenomena that we're seeing at the moment. So I wonder if the North Koreans really think if they keep this up, they can compel Washington to just succumb and suddenly say, hey, look, we give up, you guys win, there's nothing more we can do, because that's very unlikely to happen. And I think we're seeing that right now in Ukraine, where President Putin is really trying to coerce Washington to Russian objectives with NATO and so on. And it looks like Washington is not really willing to budge so much. So I just see this paradox in the long term, and I don't know what others on the call think, but I just fundamentally don't see this as being something that is coherent in the long term and will ultimately still leave Pyongyang isolated.
I would like to sort of hear some clearer arguments about how this latest launch is or isn't a breach of North Korea's agreements with the US or United Nations Security Council resolutions.
Sure, I can jump in on that, Jacco. So it's pretty unambiguously a violation of their obligations going back to Resolution 1718, not to test ballistic missiles and weapons of mass destruction. This is a very large ballistic missile designed to deliver nuclear warheads. So it's a violation in that regard. Even the Blue House has already said this. I think what's going to be interesting is that, China and Russia's position at the UNSC has changed quite a bit since 2017, right? Even after the MARV test earlier this month, China refused the idea of revisiting the issue of sanctions. And I think part of the explanation for that is shifting geopolitics. But also one of the takeaways that China and Russia have had since the collapse of the Hanoi summit is that if and when North Korea returns to this kind of testing, the onus is really on the United States for not having taken that deal in Hanoi. In many other ways. So that's the first thing. The second is on the issue of this moratorium, which I did a pretty long thread about this on Twitter, because I think the moratorium is I think people have different understandings of the moratorium. But going back to the third plenary of the 7th Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea in April 2018, which was when Kim announced the moratorium, there's sort of two things that Kim says in that plenary report. The first is when he's sort of observing the accomplishments of the Pyongyang missile testing campaign between 2013 and 2017. And he says, things went great. We don't have to carry out additional IRBM or ICBM tests to improve our missile capabilities. But then there's a second section in that report where he talks about the resolutions, i.e. the decisions that he has taken. And when he outlines the decision on missile testing moratorium, he omits IRBMs. He only says intercontinental range ballistic missiles. He says, after April 21st, 2018, Juche 107, we will no longer test any more ICBMs. But it's more complicated than that, because it always is with North Korea. And so at some point in 2019, and I'm not sure exactly when this happened, either at the Hanoi summit or maybe the June 30th meeting at Panmunjom between Trump and Kim, there may have been an assurance given to the United States that the long-range missile testing moratorium also includes IRBMs, because not only did we hear that from former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo not long after the June 30th meeting, but the North Koreans themselves, in a statement, which admittedly wasn't as authoritative as Kim Jong-un speaking at a plenary, this was, I believe, the intra-Korean office that came out with this statement, pointed out that the moratorium covered intermediate-range ballistic missiles. So there's a lot of ambiguity around if IRBMs are covered. I don't think the North Koreans are interpreting this latest test to violate the moratorium, because I think if that were so, alongside this statement about from the Academy of National Defense Science on the test, we might have seen an MFA statement or something else in state media about why they are ending the moratorium. And also the Blue House seems to have that same interpretation because, as Jeongmin said, they are indicating that this is coming close to violating the moratorium. So those are my thoughts.
So what we can say for sure is that if and when North Korea does test an ICBM, then that will be a clear breach of all of its agreements and moratoria.
Correct.
Yeah, but they never agreed to the sanctions. So
no,
when you say they violated sanctions, it's
right. What I meant to say was, is it a violation of United Nations Security Council resolutions or of its agreements? Of course, no country ever accepts sanctions that are placed on itself. That's, I think, a historical given for every situation. Is there a chance that a missile test like this, particularly as Ankit mentioned, was not, or I think Colin mentioned, was not announced ahead of time? Is there a chance that a missile test could accidentally hit something sensitive like a commercial airplane or a ship or an inhabited island or a neighboring country?
I mean, the risk is there. So with aviation, most countries that carry out missile tests will notify airmen. It's called a notice to airmen, saying avoid this airspace because we will be carrying out military activities. Now, obviously, the risk of two relatively small objects on a global scale colliding in 3 dimensions is pretty low. The risk is always if there's a huge breakup of the missile airframe and a ton of debris fragments sort of scattered throughout the air. That's considerably more risky. So as far as I know, that's never happened, certainly never happened with North Korea. But the North Koreans don't provide advance warning, right? They said they would actually in 2018 when Kim Jong-un was in his charm offensive and they were trying to, be responsible players. They said that they would provide notices to the International Civil Aviation Organization. They haven't done that. The only time the North Koreans do pre-notify is with regard to their space launches, because they insist, of course, that their space launches are peaceful, legitimate civilian activities.
Now, Jeongmin, a lot of people, civilians in South Korea who don't focus on North Korea on a day-to-day basis as we do, seem to be able to collectively shrug their shoulders and carry on. Will this have, do you imagine this would have any effect at all on the elections that are just 4 weeks away?
I would say some, but I will have to break this down to 2 different sets of what's happening. One is North Korean perception on the South Korean election as a potential factor, and the second part is how the candidates are, presidential candidates are seeing North Korea and framing it for their own utility. For South Korean citizens, though, North Korea has not been one of the main issues that they are regarding when they are planning to cast their votes on which candidate, but it has been increasingly in the news and also in some of the polls as something to talk about. It did not came from how North Korean missiles are back to back. They are not as laser focused as North Korea watchers when North Korea is firing missile. They have some sort of fatigue on these North Korean missiles. They don't take count. But because a person like conservative presidential candidate Yoon Suk-yeol has been using North Korea quite a lot to brand himself as a strongman leader who will deploy more THAAD in South Korea and other strategic assets as well. And Lee Jae-myung camp, the progressive, they have been criticizing Yoon Suk-yeol for quote-unquote warmongering behavior. The other part of this is whether or not North Korea is trying to influence South Korean election, right? The progressive candidate Lee Jae-myung has been going with this point, saying that North Korea should stop missile testing, partly because it is driving a wedge between public opinion in South Korea, talking about past allegations of North Korean election intervention. But it seems that from North Korea's point of view, South Korea is not the top factor when they are considering whether or not to launch a missile or what type of missile they're launching. Like we discussed so far, U.S. and China is their core state actor factors that they are considering, not South Korea, because from North Korean point of view, regardless of which candidates win in South Korea in March, they have a way to pursue their goals, even if it's just a conservative candidate winning.
Now, late last night, I had trouble sleeping, in fact, and I was up at 2 a.m. Watching the BBC News, and they had somebody on to comment about this story who I would not consider to be a North Korea expert or a missile expert. And in the first sentence out of his mouth was the word provocation. And that's something that the mainstream media is always quick to say that this is a provocation, and that, or also that North Korea is simply trying to get the attention of America. Now, a regular listener and good friend of this podcast broke down the bigger picture situation, I guess, into three very clear and sensible questions. And the first one is utility. Why does North Korea test missiles at all? And I think we've talked a little bit about that, about sort of perfecting systems. The second one, timing. Why do they test them now? And the third one being frequency. Why do they test or conduct so many tests in a short period of time? And I want to go back to the second question there, timing. Does North Korea normally test missiles in January, or is that an unusual thing, Chad?
No, it doesn't usually conduct this frequency of missile testing in January. In fact, it's very rare for there to be this many missiles tested in January. But yeah, fundamentally, I just think it goes back to this window of opportunity issue I mentioned at the top, where the US is concentrated elsewhere, it's focused elsewhere. I mean, Josh Rogan of the Washington Post, he actually wrote in a column just a few days ago that basically this is the US has trouble concentrating on more than one national security crisis at a time. So I think North Korea is seeing that, the Olympics, the window that's open before it starts, the South Korean election that's coming up. I think all of this combined is just giving North Korea a pretty safe month to do high frequency of missile tests.
To misquote Sigmund Freud, sometimes a missile is just a missile without any hidden meaning. Is that more than likely the case here, that it's not intentionally a provocation or an attempt to reach out to America, but simply just a missile for the sake of testing weapons?
No, I don't think it's just a technical thing. I think it's partly also political signaling. Regarding your second question that you received, the timing. Although it is also true that this is a window of time where they have a very good condition to test all the missiles with a minimum political risk up until today. But also it came after United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken said North Korea is trying to gain attention and so on and so forth. And North Korea has been arguing that the exact thing, that they are doing this for improving self-defense technicalities. And if we see the timing, we can see that they are, in some sort of fashion, they are trying to politically signal to Washington.
Colin, domestically, the focus hasn't been so much on this, right? I mean, in recent, I heard that in a recent Rodong Shinmun, the previous launch, not the one held yesterday, but the one before that, wasn't on page one. It was something about agriculture. So what are the North Korean people being told?
The one you're referring to is last Friday, on January 28th. There were a lot of reports in state media, but by virtue of, the front page was Kim Jong-un visiting a military airfield where they're going to destroy it and turn it into a vegetable greenhouse farm. They didn't mention the fact that it was a military airfield, but it was quite obvious that that's what it was. And the second page was him visiting a munitions factory where they're producing an important weapon system, as state media put it. And then just by virtue of him being at those events, they're going to be in the top. And then the missile tests that they were reporting on, which was January 25th and January 27th missile test from previous days, that was down on page 3 or page 2, I can't remember, but not page 1. And so the curious thing about that is, though, that state media was very obviously telling us Well, the previous day, South Korea told us the South Korean military announced the location of the missile test on January 27th in the Ryonpo area near Hamhung on the East Coast. So state media knows that we know that from the South Korean military. They're quite accurate with their assessments, but not always perfectly accurate of the location of the launch. And then the next day, state media tells us that Kim Jong-un was in that exact same place on an unknown date. They didn't specify the date, but they said that he was in that place inspecting the airfield that's going to be a vegetable greenhouse farm. So state media is winking at us that Kim Jong-un was in the same place as the missile test, likely on the same day. But then they didn't mention Kim Jong-un in the report about the missile test. So I think that it's part of this curiosity of Kim Jong-un. He didn't attend any missile tests officially. He didn't publicly attend any between March 2020 and then one earlier this month, hypersonic missile test. So, but we've also caught state media attempting to Photoshop evidence of him being at a missile test out before. So we've caught them basically lying about his presence at a test. So there's definitely some signaling going on there. Like they are sensitive to Kim Jong-un being at a missile test publicly. Now, whether that's to diminish the importance of it because they're worried about the domestic audience, needing to feel like their civilian concerns are more important, or whether it's trying to diminish the impact of Kim Jong-un being there for the benefit of foreign actors like the United States. It's really unclear, and it's really up in the air on that.
And then there was something in the news, North Korean state media quite recently about haircuts that I feel certain will become a clickbait or Daily Mail kind of article. What was the haircut story, and how does this fit into the the recent picture?
Well, that's a purely non-missile concern, but over the last year, they've had these congresses of big political unions that cover various aspects of adult society or also the youth. So it's like the youth, the women's, the trade union workers, and the agriculture union. And they each had a congress in the last year. And so Kim Jong-un would send a letter to each of these laying out all these kind of vague instructions and that are mostly ideological. So the big picture is the party is very worried about the ideological purity of the population. They need people to, Kim Jong-un talks in such a, just please sincerely believe in the cause of the socialist system and the party, and everything will be a utopia. And so he mentioned in a few of these, including one that came out in state media yesterday about the agricultural union Congress, about, you need to have a certain haircut and you need to wear your clothes a certain way in order to be a model socialist citizen. So he said this a few times. It's just about, we have to remember North Koreans have to abide by this social system. They have to be a socialist citizen, perfectly considerate of all their peers and having no individualism and no desire to do something that would not benefit the state. So it's just all part of that.
Well, as we approach the end of this podcast, to sort of bring it back a little bit to where we are now, we've got the Olympics starting in less than a week. We've got South Korea's presidential election in just over 4 weeks, or just over a month, I should say, and a congressional midterm election in the United States later on this year on the 8th of November. What can we expect from North Korea in terms of weapons testing and activities in that time frame? Who wants to kick that off first?
I'll say not testing, because I don't want to predict if there's going to be an ICBM test or not. And we've all just been talking about it, and I have no idea. But in terms of military parades, as Ankit mentioned earlier, and as we can see in satellite imagery, they're preparing for a military parade. Now, this is the 80th anniversary of the birth of Kim Jong-il and the 110th anniversary of the birth of Kim Il-sung, the two former leaders. And that's going to be Kim Jong-il's is February 16th, and Kim Il-sung's birthday is April 15th. So what happened the last time that these were round numbers, 5 years ago, and then 10 years ago, on there were military parades on all four of these round numbers during Kim Jong-un's rule. So for Kim Jong-il's birthday, February 16th, it's probably going to be some kind of small-scale military parade, maybe just troops marching, like an oath-taking ceremony sort of thing. But I would say let's expect a big military parade on April 15th in the center of Pyongyang, and they could potentially show off existing missiles or new missiles. And back to what Chad said earlier, do they consider an accomplishment of one of their 5-year military development plan to merely show off a new system like they did with the Hwasong 17 ICBM? Or, would we expect them to test it sometime in the next 5 years? But, they could show off something big on April 15th. And I wouldn't expect something big on February 16th, but you never know.
Let me cut back to Ankit for a moment. Ankit, didn't you say something about there being an order to celebrate Kim Jong-il's coming birthday on February 16th with splendor?
Right. So they talked about that at the Politburo meeting. But again, I mean, the indicator of what is considered to be sufficiently full of splendor is up to interpretation. A military parade would meet that.
I don't think they were talking about an American sugar substitute. So I'm expecting something a little big to equal splendor.
Well, that's right. I mean, the other options are, I think, we're very overdue for a satellite launch, and that is one of the things that Kim Jong-un put on his 8th.
When was the last one?
Last one was in February 2016. So it was quite a while ago. And there have been some indicators in state media last fall, articles here and there talking about space and related activities. Also in the inter-Korean context, South Korea is moving towards launching its own military reconnaissance satellites. So in terms of the tit-to-tat inter-Korean arms race aspect, there could be an impetus there. The 100th anniversary.
When you say that launch, then we would be expecting some kind of satellite that would be able to spy on South Korea and other territory. Is that the sort of satellite we mean?
It depends. I mean, the North Koreans have never launched a satellite payload that's done anything useful. They have indicated aspirations to do that. And NATO has been working on quite a few things. Their satellite control center in Pyongyang is being well maintained. I was about to say that for Kim Il-sung's 100th anniversary, right after Kim Jong-un inherited power, they did carry out a satellite launch, which was the reason that the Leap Day deal with the Obama administration actually did fall apart that year. A satellite launch has a number of advantages for the North Koreans, right? They have new missile engines that they would like to test that they could use as part of a satellite launch vehicle. Like I said earlier, they pre-notify of satellite launches, which is a very good way to build generate a crisis with the U.S. administration and offer the Biden administration an opportunity to try to bargain its way out of a satellite launch if they were to choose to take that route. I doubt they actually would, but that might be one of the perceived advantages. I'm not, I'm going to follow Colin's lead and not try to predict too much about what the North Koreans will do. One thing I will point out that we haven't talked about too much in terms of the broader context this year is, we talk a lot about the Olympics and the sensitivity of that event for China. But I actually think in a way the bigger event this year might be the 20th Party Congress in China, which is a big moment for Xi Jinping, particularly as the demographic picture in China and the economy aren't, necessarily where the CCP would like it to be. This is when Xi is supposed to either announce some kind of heir apparent or consolidate his leader for life position further. So it is possible that the North Koreans might be choosing the worst, or at least the better of two options, which is to make the first half of 2022 a little bit more difficult for Xi, even if that means conducting a few tests during or right after the Olympics, and keeping the latter part of the year a little bit more quiet as the 20th Party Congress comes together in China.
Just remind us of the timeline for that Congress, if you would.
No date, but I believe it is either supposed to take place in late October or November.
Got it. Okay. Anybody else? What else do we expect for the rest of this year from North Korea?
I mean, for me, the big question is whether or not we're going to see any of these other missile-related programs push forward. Like I said earlier, there are two very large SLBMs that have been trotted out at military parades in the last 18 months. One of them was described by North Korean state media as like the world's strongest weapon or world's greatest weapon. There's, like I said, the Hwasong 17 ICBM, which is still untested. Yeah, I just think if they do go ahead with any of these things, it could trigger a bunch of consequences. I would be interested to see what kind of pressure there would be on the UN sanctions front if the Chinese and Russians would be maybe a bit more willing to support sanctions. Maybe not, as Ankit suggested earlier. But yeah, it just seems like North Korea have very limited options to try and change the economy, and this is just one area where Kim Jong-un can continue to show superficial progress.
Chad, what about the submarine? What if they say they've deployed their new submarine with the nuclear?
Yeah, that's I forgot about that. So yeah, we remember in July 2019, Kim Jong-un toured this very large submarine that was under construction. It's never been formally launched. That's something else we could see that I guess would fall under a threshold of acceptable military developments.
How close would a submarine be able to legally get into South Korea's sort of maritime territory before it's too close? What's the range on that sort of thing? Is it a 5-mile limit or something?
I mean, so I don't think the North Koreans have never actually a large submarine like that, the Romeo class. The operations that they have undertaken are usually into the East Sea, and they usually test comms. It would be very risky to risk a high value asset like that by bringing it close to South Korean waters. The territorial water limit is 12 nautical miles, 200 kilometers for the 200 nautical miles for the exclusive economic zone of South Korea, where military activity is permitted. But again, I think the North Koreans would choose to use smaller submarines for those kinds of operations, like they did, for instance, when they sunk the Chonan in 2010.
Okay, well that's good. Thank you for clarifying that, Ankit. Well, I think that's where we're going to have to.
Sorry, Jacco.
Final
I have
thoughts
one
from
more.
Jeongmin?
So when it comes to what to look out for this year about inter-Korean arms race, actually, we saw a lot of tit for tat going back and forth between South Korea and North Korea when it comes to military equipment testing, weapons testing. And I think even if the progressives win, regardless of who wins in South Korea in March, the trend will likely continue. The progressive candidate Lee Jae-myung, he has already pledged for a nuclear submarine and other deterrence capabilities, although it's not as hawkish as Yoon Suk-yeol, the conservative candidate, who has a lot of pledges when it comes to building up capabilities like the kill chain, preemptive strike, hypersonic missile, ultra precision guided missiles, and so on and so forth. So for North Korea, even if that South Korea wouldn't be like a main factor when they are conducting military drills or exercises or weapon testing, it will still provide justification for them rhetorically to say that because South Korea is continuing to build up its armed forces, they will do that too.
Just one final observation on the inter-Korean piece. I find it, I guess, somewhat amusing that the strongest statement out of the Blue House since 2019 with regard to any North Korean missile test has come after the test of a missile that the North Koreans would almost certainly never use to strike South Korea. When all of these other missiles that they've been testing the entire time, KN-23s, 24s, all of which would be used very early in a conflict to strike South Korean territory, infrastructure, airfields, ports, and so forth. The Blue House has had a very different reaction to. So that's just probably, something to mull over. I just find it a little odd.
That may be a reflection of a fundamental doubt in South Korea that North Korea would use those weapons against South Korean territory.
It could be. I think, unfortunately, that's a dangerous bet to make, because you might find yourself being wrong halfway into a conflict when it's too late.
Well, that's a grim note to end on, but end we must. So thank you once again, Colin, Ankit, Chad, and Jeongmin, for coming on our Miscellaneous show. I do hope that name gets used in the title there somehow. Chad, talk to Arius about that. Ladies and gentlemen, if you already have an NK News subscription, take a look at our NK Pro platform, which offers unparalleled services specifically catered to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula on a daily basis. You can inquire about access at membership@nknews.org today. Also, if you have any feedback, questions, or guest recommendations, you can tweet them at us or you can email us at podcast@nknews.org. Our thanks, as always, to Arius Dare and Brian Betts for facilitating this podcast, and to Gabby Magnuson, our post-recording producer genius. Thanks, and listen again next time.